The wagon
We
will
need to
crack
talk.
somewhere around
It's
the 3rd
important.
mile past Cutter's
What is
Creek.
it?
And that was
Trouble's
when Clara
coming. We
Weston
have to
understood
prepare.
that God had a particular
with
sense
you.
of
What
humor
do we
when
do?
it came to her life.
Together we fight.
She sat in the driver's seat with both reins in her hands, the leather worn thin where her palms had gripped it for 6 straight hours, and she looked at the dry, cracked earth ahead and did not cry. She had decided somewhere around the Oklahoma border that she was done crying. A woman of 44 did not have tears left to waste on broken wheels and dead ends. The horse, a brown mare she had bought for $12 and a pair of boots from a man in Abilene who smelled like regret, stood patiently in her harness, one ear turned back toward Clara as if asking what came next. "I don't know, Molly," Clara said out loud. "I genuinely do not know." She climbed down from the wagon with the slow, deliberate care of a woman whose knees had started complaining a few years back and hadn't stopped since. The wheel had split clean through the spoke. She had no spare. She had $4.30 in a small leather pouch tucked inside her left boot, a single trunk of belongings in the wagon bed, and a folded letter in her coat pocket that she had read so many times the creases were like scars. The letter was from her late husband's brother, Harold Weston of Dry Fork, Texas. It had arrived 8 months ago, after Thomas died, offering her a position as housekeeper on his ranch. She had spent 6 of those months refusing. She had spent the other 2 packing. She was not a woman who asked for help. She had not been raised that way. Her mother had washed other people's floors on her hands and knees until she was 62 years old and never once asked anyone to hand her the mop. Clara had inherited that spine, that particular brand of dignity that looked a lot like stubbornness from the outside. But the winter had been long, and the money Thomas left behind was gone, and there were only so many times a woman could count $4 and call it a plan. So here she was, a broken wheel on a dirt road she didn't know, somewhere between the town of Redgrove and a ranch called Sagebrush that she had only a hand-drawn map to find. She pulled the map from her coat pocket and studied it. Harold had drawn it himself, which was apparent. The man had labeled a rock, big rock, and a tree, and had apparently believed that was sufficient. Clara folded the map, looked at the horizon, looked back at the map. Useless, she said. To the map, to the situation, possibly to herself. She unhitched Molly from the wagon, tied her trunk to the mare's back as best she could with the rope she kept for emergencies, and began walking. The ranch appeared an hour before sunset, and it did not look like rescue. It looked like stubbornness in wooden form. A main house that had clearly been built by a man who prioritized function over anything resembling comfort. A barn that was larger than the house, which told her everything she needed to know about the man's priorities. Fencing that went on for what seemed like half the world, all of it in good repair, which told her something different, that whoever kept this place was not lazy. Just practical in a way that forgot to include curtains. There were cattle in the far field. She could see them in the fading light, dark shapes moving slowly across the gold grass. She counted without meaning to, an old habit, and reached 40 before she stopped. She rode Molly up the main path, her trunk bumping awkwardly behind her, and stopped in front of the house. A man came out of the barn. He was not Harold. Harold was 58, stout, with red cheeks and a laugh she remembered from Thomas's funeral. Inappropriately loud, the kind of laugh that didn't know what room it was in. She had met him twice. Both times he had called her little lady, and both times she had smiled and hated it. This man was different. He was perhaps 50, perhaps a few years more, though the sun did complicated things to a man's face out here and you could never quite be sure. Tall, but not in a showy way, the height of a man who had simply grown and never thought about it. His hair was gray at the temples and dark everywhere else, cut short and practical. His face was weathered in the way that good wood was weathered, not damaged by it but shaped, made more itself by everything it had lived through. He wore no hat, which struck her as odd out here. His shirt was dirty from work. He had a hammer in one hand and a nail between his teeth, and he took the nail out when he saw her and held both things at his side and looked at her with an expression she could not immediately read. Not threatening, not welcoming, just looking. "I'm looking for Harold Weston," Clara said from atop Molly. The man studied her for a moment. "Harold's in Amarillo," he said. His voice was low and even, like water running over flat stone. "Medical visit." He's been gone 3 weeks. Back in 2 more, if the doctors let him travel. Clara sat very still. She had written Harold 2 weeks ago to tell him she was coming. She had not received a response, but she had assumed. Incorrectly, it now seemed that silence meant acceptance. "I'm Clara Weston," she said. "Harold's sister-in-law. He offered me a position here." The man looked at her trunk, looked at Molly, looked back at Clara. "I know who you are," he said. "He mentioned you'd be coming sometime. Didn't mention when." He paused. "My name is Eli Grant. I run this ranch for Harold. Have for 11 years. Is there someone, a housekeeper, a woman on the property?" Clara began. "No," Eli said simply. "It's me, 2 ranch hands who sleep in the bunkhouse, and a cook who comes Tuesdays and Thursdays." Clara looked at the house, looked at this man she did not know, standing alone on a ranch in the middle of Texas in the gathering dark. Every instinct she had, the ones her mother had sharpened in her, the ones 44 years of careful living had refined, told her to be careful, to measure the distance between herself and danger and keep that distance. She was tired. Her back ached. She had $4.30 and a broken wagon a mile up the road. "I'll need a room," she said. Her voice did not waver. "I'll stay in the house and earn my keep until Harold returns. If the arrangement doesn't suit either of us after that, I'll go." Eli Grant looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his expression, not quite amusement, not quite respect, but in the neighborhood of both. "Third door on the left," he said, and turned back to the barn. Part 2. The man who didn't explain himself. The room was plain and clean and smelled of cedar and old wood. There was a bed with a quilt that had clearly been made by someone's grandmother, precise and faded and utterly without sentiment now. A small dresser, a window that faced the east, and a hook on the back of the door for coats. That was all. Clara set her trunk at the foot of the bed and stood in the middle of the room and breathed. Plain was fine. Plain she could work with. She had slept in worse. After Thomas died and the house in Dodge City was sold to cover the debts she hadn't known about. The debts Thomas had kept from her with a gentleness she had chosen to interpret as protection and had only later recognized as cowardice. She had spent 3 months in a boarding house room half this size. She washed her face and hands in the basin that had been set out, changed her traveling clothes for the gray dress she kept for working, and went to find the kitchen. It was at the back of the house and it was frankly a disaster. Not dirty, someone cleaned it, but the organization made no sense. The flour was on the bottom shelf. The coffee was next to the lamp oil. The cast iron skillet was hanging in a place that required a step stool to reach, which meant whoever put it there was 6 feet tall and never cooked. Clara looked at all of this and felt something loosen in her chest. This she knew how to fix. She found eggs and salt pork and got to work. She heard Eli come in from outside about 20 minutes later. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the pan on the stove and then at her with that same unreadable expression. "I didn't ask you to cook," he said. Not unkindly, just stating it. "You didn't have to," Clara said. "Sit down or don't. But the food's getting made either way." A pause. Then the sound of a chair pulling out from the table. She set a plate in front of him and one at the place across the table for herself and sat down and ate. He ate. Neither of them spoke for a while. The wind came through the gaps in the window frame and the oil lamp on the table threw their shadows long against the wall. "Your wagon's up at Bender's Bend," Eli said finally. "Yes, we'll gave out. I'll take the work wagon out tomorrow and bring it in." "You don't have to." "I know." She looked at him across the table. He was focused on his plate, not avoiding her gaze so much as simply not offering it. Like a man who had learned that looking directly at things sometimes invited conversations he wasn't prepared for. "Do you always do things people don't ask you to?" she asked. He looked up then. A slight shift at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "Ranch work. You do what needs doing or it doesn't get done. Is that your philosophy? It's just sense." She ate another bite. "Harold writes about you. In his letters to Thomas years ago. He said you were the best ranch hand he ever kept. Harold talks too much." He also said you were the most difficult man he'd ever employed. Eli Grant picked up his coffee cup. Harold's usually right about most things. In the days that followed, Clara learned the shape of the ranch the way you learn a stranger's face. Slowly, detail by detail, until it started to become familiar. She reorganized the kitchen on the second day. She found the flour where it belonged and the coffee away from the lamp oil, and hung the cast iron where a person of average height could reach it. Nobody commented on this. When she came down the third morning, the kitchen had not been rearranged back. She took that as agreement. She met the two ranch hands, brothers named Pete and Cody Marsh, both of them somewhere in their late 30s, sunburned and cheerful in the uncomplicated way of men who spent most of their time outdoors and didn't overthink things. They called her ma'am, and ate everything she put in front of them with an enthusiasm that was almost touching. She did not yet feel safe. She wanted to be honest with herself about that. She was a woman alone on a property in a state where she knew nobody, with a man she had met 3 days ago who said almost nothing and whose face she couldn't read. She locked her door at night. She kept her small folding knife in her apron pocket. She was careful, but she was also watching. She watched how Eli was with the horses. Patient, quiet, never rough. She watched how Pete talked to him like a man who respected but wasn't afraid of the person above him. She watched how he fixed a section of fence in the south field by himself in the middle of a Thursday. Not because anyone asked him to, but because he had noticed it needed doing. She watched him the evening he found the calf that had gotten separated from its mother and spent 40 minutes in the dark, working by lantern light, guiding the frightened animal back to the herd. He didn't know she saw this. He did it with the same flat practicality he brought to everything, no performance in it. By the end of the first week, she had not stopped being careful. But she had started to understand the difference between a man you needed to fear and a man who simply had no interest in softening the edges of himself for other people's comfort. Eli Grant was the second kind. Part 3. What the evenings were made of. It became a habit without either of them deciding it would. After dinner, Clara would take her mending or her reading to the front porch, and eventually Eli would come out and sit in the other chair and drink his coffee, and they would sit in the dark for a while with the stars coming out over the hills and the sound of cattle in the distance, and they wouldn't say much. She found she didn't mind the quiet. Thomas had filled every room he was ever in with sound. Not unpleasant sound, mostly, but constant. He talked to fill silence the way some men drank to fill loneliness. She had spent 21 years half listening, nodding, feeding the conversation so it wouldn't stall, and she had been good at it. She was only now, sitting in the dark with a man who seemed to have made peace with not speaking, understanding how tired that had made her. "You've been on this ranch 11 years, she said one evening, about 2 weeks in. Not a question, just a fact she had been holding. Yes. Before that. A pause. He looked out at the dark field. New Mexico, mostly. Some time in Colorado. Ranching? Some of it. She waited to see if he'd offer more. He didn't. "You're not from Texas," she said. "No. Where then?" He looked at her. It was a steady look, not unfriendly, but she could see him deciding something. "Virginia," he said at last. "Long time ago." Something in the way he said it made her understand that Virginia was a door with no handle on the outside. She didn't push. "I'm from Missouri," she said instead. "Came west when I married Thomas. Thought I wanted adventure." She paused. "Turned out I mainly just got wind and hard winters." Something shifted in his expression. The almost smile again. "You didn't like it?" "I didn't say that. I said it was different than I expected." She watched the stars. "Most things are." He drank his coffee. After a while he said, "Harold says your husband passed last year. October. I'm sorry. Were you married?" she asked. A long pause. Long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. "Yes," he said. "She died. 18 years ago." "I'm sorry," Clara said, and meant it. The stars came out fully. The wind moved through the grass with a sound like something breathing. "You get used to the space," Eli said eventually. "You think you won't. You think the space where they were will always feel like a wound. But after a while it's just space. Like a field. You can put other things in it or leave it alone, and either way the sky's still there. Clara looked at him. He seemed almost surprised at himself for saying it. He looked back out at the field. That's the most you've said at once, she said carefully. I'll try to do better. I didn't say it was unwelcome. ## Part 4. The Thing About Trust. Harold's letter arrived on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after Clara had. He was recovering well. The doctors in Amarillo had found what they were looking for, a problem with his heart, manageable with rest and less red meat, neither of which Harold would enjoy, and he expected to return within the month. He was pleased Clara had arrived. He hoped she was settling in. He mentioned, with a breezy certainty that was entirely Harold, that he was sure she and Eli were getting on fine because Eli got on fine with everyone once you stopped expecting him to smile about it. Clara put the letter down and looked out the kitchen window at the yard, where Eli was working on the water pump with Pete, both of them frowning at it in the focused way of men confronting a mechanical problem they're determined to win. Gets on fine with everyone. She thought about that. In the 4 weeks she had been here, she had watched Eli Grant carefully and revised her understanding of him at least a dozen times. She had arrived afraid, not specifically of him, but of the general uncertainty he represented. A strange man in a strange place and herself with no real plan beyond getting through each day. She had kept her knife in her pocket and her door locked and her trust at a distance. She had slowly, without quite making a decision about it, begun to leave the knife in the drawer. She still locked her door, a woman's habit, built from sense, not fear of any one man, but the tightness in her chest when she heard his footsteps in the hall had eased. What had changed it was small things accumulated like coins in a jar. The morning she had been ill with a headache so bad she couldn't lift her head. She had stayed in her room, and when she finally came downstairs in the late afternoon there was a tray outside her door. Not left by anyone she'd seen, but there. Bread, broth kept warm with a folded cloth under the bowl, a small glass of water. Eli had not mentioned it. She had not thanked him directly. The next morning everything was normal and neither of them brought it up. The afternoon Pete had dropped something heavy on his hand and cut it badly. Eli had cleaned and wrapped it with a steadiness and care that surprised her. Not rough or dismissive, genuinely gentle. He had talked Pete through it in a low, even voice and sent him to rest and done the rest of the day's work himself without complaint. The evening Cody's horse had spooked and thrown him and they'd all stood around the boy in the dusty yard. Eli had been the one who checked his limbs methodically, asked the right questions, made the determination that nothing was broken but the boy needed rest and watching. He had done it all with the confidence of a man who had been the calm in a storm before. She thought about Virginia, about a life that had started there and ended up here, in the dry heat of Texas, 11 years on someone else's land, quietly making things work. There was grief in him. She recognized it because she carried her own. Not Thomas. She was honest enough with herself to admit that what she mourned for Thomas was more complicated than simple love, but the life she had thought she was living. The story she had told herself about her own future. Grief came in all shapes. Eli's grief was old and had been folded so many times it had become part of the fabric of him. You couldn't separate it out. But it wasn't rotting him. It had made him, instead, into something careful. Something that moved through the world with attention. She found she respected that. The first real conversation they had, the one that felt like something being admitted, happened on a Thursday evening after the cook, Mrs. Ramos, had gone home for the night. Clara was washing the dishes and Eli came in from outside and stopped in the kitchen and didn't leave, the way he sometimes did, as if his body had decided to stay in a room before his mind quite agreed to it. "Can I ask you something?" Clara said, not turning around from the sink. "You can ask. That's not quite the same as saying you'll answer." A pause. "No, but ask anyway." She dried her hands and turned around. "Why do you stay here? 11 years on someone else's land. You're not a young man doing the only thing available to him. You're—" she searched for the word. "Capable. You could have your own place." He leaned against the doorframe and looked at the floor for a moment. She had learned this meant he was deciding how honest to be. "Had my own place once," he said. "In New Mexico. 40 acres and a house I built myself." He looked up. "Lost it. Bad year, then a worse one. then a bank that wasn't interested in reasons. After that, he stopped. After that, I wasn't looking to own things anymore. Things? Or things, he said, definite. Then, quieter. People included. She absorbed this. The kitchen was very still. Outside, something moved in the brush. Probably a coyote, and the sound passed. That's a lonely way to live, she said. Not unkindly, just honestly. He looked at her directly for the first time in this conversation. Yes, he said. It is. The admission landed in the room between them like something fragile set down on a table. Neither of them reached for it. After a moment, Clara said, I was lonely in my marriage, which is a particular kind of lonely, the kind where the loneliness doesn't seem like it should be allowed because you're not alone. It took me a long time to name it. Eli said nothing, but he was listening the way he listened, fully, without interruption, without the habit of some men to start assembling their own response before you'd finished. Thomas was not a bad man, she said carefully. I want to be accurate. He was charming and he was funny and he meant well, in the way that men mean well when they haven't been taught to think very hard about the people around them. He kept things from me, not out of cruelty, out of habit, I suppose, the habit of men who believe that managing things on their own is the same as being strong. She paused. I found out about the debts after. That was the hardest part. Not that there were debts, but that he'd spent 21 years deciding what I could know. Eli's expression had shifted, something attentive in it now and something careful. I'm sorry, he said again. And again she believed him. I'm not asking for pity, she said. I've been trying to explain myself to myself for a year now. Why I stayed. Why I didn't ask more questions. Why I'm here at 44, starting a thing I should have figured out 20 years ago. She looked at him steadily. You asked me your first night if I needed anything, and I said no. I always say no. I know, he said. I'm trying to learn to say something different. The lamp flickered once. Eli looked at the window, then back at her. That's hard work, he said. Yes. Worth doing, though. I think so. Part 5, What Ground Costs. Harold arrived on a Thursday afternoon in a wagon driven by a man from town, looking thinner than Clara had expected and more pleased to see her than she'd anticipated. He embraced her in the yard with the loud warmth that was his natural register, calling her Clara girl, in a way that should have irritated her and somehow didn't, because he meant it genuinely and some people's affection was just built at volume. You look well, he said, holding her at arm's length and studying her. I am well, she said. It was more true than she'd expected it to be. He clapped Eli on the shoulder. Eli received this with the patience of a man accustomed to it. She giving you trouble? Harold asked, grinning. About the kitchen organization, Eli said seriously. Yes. Harold laughed his big room-wrong laugh. Good. This kitchen has needed a woman's sense for 10 years. Clara looked at Eli. Eli looked at Clara. A shared pause, a mutual acknowledgement that a woman's sense was an unfortunate way to phrase it, but that Harold was happy and harmless and some things weren't worth the energy. They sat down to dinner that night, the four of them, Harold, Clara, Eli, and Mrs. Ramos, who had stayed late to celebrate the return. And it was the first meal at that table that felt like something other than logistics. Harold talked as Harold did. He talked about Amarillo and the doctors and the indignity of being told to eat less beef in Texas and the hotel where he'd stayed that had wallpaper with roosters on it. He talked about how the ranch was looking fine, better than fine, how Eli always kept things running better than anyone had a right to expect. He talked about Thomas. I miss him, Harold said simply, with a directness that Clara respected. He was my brother. He had his faults, God knows. Lord knows. But he was my brother and I miss him. Yes, Clara said. Harold looked at her with older brother eyes, Thomas's brother, but looking at her the way Thomas never quite had, with a kind of clear seeing. You're okay, he said. Not a question. I'm getting there, she said. He nodded. That was enough for him. After dinner, she and Eli ended up on the porch again. Harold had gone to bed early, exhausted from the journey, and the night had come in cool and clean with a half-moon rising over the east pasture. They sat in the accustomed chairs. The accustomed silence. "He's glad you're here," Eli said. "I know. So am I." She looked at him. He was looking out at the field, his coffee cup in both hands, and he said it the way he said most true things, quietly, without fuss, as if the fact existed whether he spoke it or not and he was simply choosing to say it. "I'm glad I'm here too," she said, "which is a thing I did not expect to be able to say." He nodded once. "I was afraid," she said, "when I arrived. Not of you specifically, but of all of it." "I know," he said. "You were careful. It was sensible. You noticed. I notice most things." A pause. "I wanted you to know you were safe. I didn't know how to say it that didn't sound like something a man says when he's trying to convince you of something." Clara looked at him. "So you just acted it." "I tried to." "You did," she said. "It took me a few weeks, but you did." The half-moon climbed. The cattle settled in the far field, their distant sounds carrying in the still air. "What happens now?" Clara asked. Not of him exactly, of the question in general. "Harold will need a lot of help," Eli said. "The heart thing is serious. He won't manage the books anymore or the decisions. He'll need someone he trusts." "He trusts you." "He trusts both of us," Eli said. "He was very clear about that in Amarillo. He wrote to me while he was there." He paused. "He said he hoped you'd be willing to stay on, not just as housekeeper, as someone who manages things, the household accounts, the decisions he can't make anymore." Clara was quiet for a moment. "He asked you to tell me this?" "He asked me to see how you felt about it, before he asked you himself." She considered this. The ranch in the dark, the stars, the chair that had, over 6 weeks, become in some quiet way hers. "What do you think?" she asked Eli. "About me staying? Honestly." He turned to look at her then, and his expression was as open as she had seen it. Not wide open, not the kind of openness that came cheap, but the careful openness of a man who had been closed for a long time and was choosing, deliberately and with full knowledge of the cost, to be otherwise. "I think," he said, "that this place has been waiting for someone who knows how to see what needs doing and does it without being asked. And I think you are precisely that person." She looked at him. "That's a very practical answer." "I'm a practical man." "You are," she agreed. "And I think you mean more than you're saying." He held her gaze. "Yes," he said. "I do." The moon moved. The wind ran through the grass. "I'll tell Harold yes," she said. Part 6. Building something. The weeks that followed were the hardest and the best she had known in years. Hard because Harold's recovery was slow and required patience of all of them, and because the ranch had needs that didn't wait for anyone to feel ready, and because managing accounts she hadn't built from the start meant learning a system that Harold had kept half in ledgers and half in his head and half, apparently, in a shoebox under the desk. Best because the work was real and the results of the work were visible, and at the end of each day she could look at what had been accomplished, and it was hers in a way that the work of her marriage had never been, folded too deeply into Thomas's decisions to ever fully belong to her. She learned the cattle business the way she learned everything, by watching, by asking when asking was unavoidable, by reading what there was to read. She made mistakes. She miscalculated feed costs in the 3rd week and came up short and had to renegotiate with a supplier in Redgrove who was not pleased about it. She handled it. The supplier was ultimately fine. She filed it away as a lesson. Eli taught her the ranch without making a show of teaching her. He simply talked in his spare way about how things worked, which pastures were used in which seasons, which cattle were good breeders and which weren't, what the market in Redgrove paid and what it should pay, and how to tell the difference. He talked while they worked, side by side, and she listened and remembered and asked questions that he answered straight. She had never been treated by a man as simply competent before. Not condescended to, not over-explained to, not helped across distances she could cross herself. Just spoken to as a person who could receive information and use it. It did something to her. Something small and structural, like a bone that had healed wrong being gently, carefully reset. Harold got stronger slowly and then, in the 6th week after his return, noticeably faster. He was sitting on the porch one morning when Clara came out with his coffee, and his color was better and his eyes were sharper, and he looked at her with that same clear older brother seeing. "I owe you an apology," he said. She sat down with her own coffee. "For what?" "For the way I handled all of this. The letter. Not being here when you arrived. Leaving you with—" he gestured vaguely. "A situation. You were ill." "I was thoughtless," he said. "Before I was ill, I was thoughtless. I offered you a position without thinking clearly about what I was asking you to walk into. A strange ranch, a man you'd never met." He stopped. "Eli would never harm a soul on this earth. I want you to know that. But I didn't know that you knew that. And I didn't consider it well enough." Clara looked at her coffee. "No," she said. "You didn't." He nodded, accepting this. "I'm sorry, Clara. I know." She paused. "I survived it. Landed on my feet. You did more than that." She looked out at the yard, where Eli and Cody were moving equipment, two men working together with the ease of long familiarity. "I did more than that," she agreed. Harold watched her watching them. He had the quiet of a man who knew something and wasn't going to say it, which was unusual enough for Harold that she noticed. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said, too innocent. "Harold." He laughed. The big laugh, then checked himself, hand to his chest, the doctor's caution still with him. "I just think it's good," he said more quietly. "That you're here. That you—" he searched for words. "That you fit." "Fit," she said. "Fit. The place. The work." A pause. "The company." She did not answer this directly. She drank her coffee and looked at the yard. But she didn't say he was wrong. Part 7. The thing that grew slowly. There was an evening in the 7th week that she thought about later. Thought about the way you thought about the moment you first understood something that had in fact been true for a while. She had taken a fall in the barn. Nothing serious. She'd stepped wrong on a wet patch near the water trough and gone down hard on one knee, the way you did when you forgot to be careful about where you put your feet. She'd sworn once, sharply, in a way her mother would have been appalled by, and gotten back up and kept working. But by evening the knee had stiffened and she was sitting at the kitchen table with it stretched out, trying to read and not doing well at it. Eli came in, saw her posture, saw her face, looked at the knee. "Ice from the box," he said. "And don't argue." "I wasn't going to argue. You were thinking about it." She was a little. He got the ice, wrapped in a cloth, and set it on her knee, and then, matter-of-factly, as if this were simply the next task, pulled a chair up across from her and sat down. "It'll stiffen worse by morning if you don't keep it iced," he said. "I know. I know you know. I'm saying it anyway." She looked at him. "You worry," she said. "A discovery." "I don't generally," he said. "About most things." He looked at the ice pack on her knee. "You're not most things." The kitchen was very quiet. She understood, sitting there with the ice on her knee and the lamp between them, that they had been moving toward this for weeks. Not dramatically, not the way it happened in the stories Thomas used to dismiss as foolish, with declarations and sudden revelations. Slowly, the way ground shifts, the way seasons turn. So gradually you almost missed it until one evening you looked up and the landscape was different. She was not a woman who had believed, after Thomas, that she would want this again. She had told herself she was done with it. Not bitterly, just practically. The inventory of a woman who had been through a thing and come out the other side and decided some things were not worth the cost. She was revising that inventory. "Eli," she said. "Clara," he said. His voice was very even. "I'm going to say something and you're going to have to decide what to do with it." "All right." "I'm not young," she said. "And I'm not soft. And I'm not looking to be managed or protected or told what I can know. I'm looking—" she paused, finding the exact word. "I'm looking for someone who moves through the world the same way I do. Quietly, and with attention, and without needing to perform any of it." He looked at her for a long time. "That's a good description of what I'm looking for too," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I said it." Something in his face shifted, that thing she had learned to watch for, the almost smile that was more than a smile really, that was something older and more specific than a smile. "You've been looking for it here?" he asked. "I've been finding it here," she said. "Careful, accurate. Without looking for it. Which is usually how things work, I've come to understand." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. His hand was roughened from years of work and large and warm, and it covered hers with a gentleness that was entirely in keeping with everything she had come to understand about him. The gentleness of a person who had been hard used by life and had decided, consciously, not to pass that on. She turned her hand over under his. He held it. They sat like that in the quiet kitchen for a while. "I'm not making you promises I'm not sure I can keep," he said eventually. "I'm not asking for any. I'm saying, it's been a long time since I've done any of this." "Same," she said. "I suspect we'll figure it out." He looked at her. "You sound confident." "I'm not particularly," she admitted. "But I've been wrong about what I was capable of before. Turned out I could do quite a lot." The almost smile, full on now. It changed his face entirely, not into something easier or softer, but into something more fully itself, the way a face looked when it stopped protecting itself from being seen. "Yes," he said. "You can." #epilogue. What the ranch became. Harold recovered fully enough by winter to cause trouble again, which was how they knew he was truly himself. He hired a girl from Red Grove to help Clara with the house, which Clara had not asked for and immediately made use of, because the difference between needing help and being willing to accept it was something she was actively working on. Pete and Cody stayed through the winter and the following spring, and Pete's wife came to join him. A quiet woman from Lubbock named Adele who could read faster than anyone Clara had ever met and who Clara liked enormously. The ranch did well. Better than the previous years, Harold said, because the accounts were kept properly now and the decisions were made by people who communicated with each other, which was apparently a thing the ranch had been missing. Clara and Eli did not make a large thing of what they were to each other. It wasn't a secret. Harold knew with the certainty of a man who had been watching two people talk themselves into something. But it wasn't announced. It was lived. In the evenings on the porch. In the way they moved around the kitchen. In the long conversations they had become capable of, and the comfortable silences between. He told her about Virginia eventually. About the family he'd come from and the war that had changed everything and the long wandering west and the things he'd left behind that he'd had to make peace with. He told her slowly over months, the way a man told things he'd kept for a long time. Carefully with pauses watching her face. She listened without interrupting. She did not try to fix anything. She simply received it and held it alongside what she knew of him, and he watched her do this and something in him. Some last held tension, some last locked door, quietly opened. She told him about Missouri, about her mother and the floors, about the girl she'd been who wanted more than the life available to her and the choices she'd made to get something different and what different had turned out to look like in practice. He listened the way she had come to rely on him, listening fully and with attention and without making it about himself. They were not young people being remade by love into something new. They were old enough people, shaped already, set in their ways and clear about their needs, but finding, with some surprise and considerable gratitude, that their shapes fit together in the dark without requiring either of them to change their fundamental outline. On a morning in early spring, when the grass was coming back green in the east pasture and the sky was that particular shade of blue that only happened in Texas in April, Clara stood on the porch with her coffee and watched the cattle moving slowly across the field, and Eli came out and stood beside her. "It's a good morning," she said. "Yes," he said. They stood together in the quiet, watching the light move across the land. She had arrived here afraid, with $4 and a broken wheel and a folded letter and a knife in her pocket that she'd thought she might need. She had arrived ready to keep her distance, to stay watchful, to give nothing she hadn't tested first. She was glad she had been wrong about what was waiting for her. Not because it was easy. It wasn't easy. Nothing about starting over at 44 was easy, and nothing about building trust with a person who had built walls the way other men built fences was a simple thing. But worth it. Worth the distance she had crossed and the fear she had moved through and the slow, deliberate work of learning that safety was not something that was handed to you but something you constructed, brick by brick, from the evidence in front of you. She had looked at the evidence. She had revised her understanding. She had stayed. Some mornings that was enough. Some mornings it was everything. The south fence needs work, Eli said. It does, she agreed. I'll get to it after the morning feed. I know you will. He looked at her sideways, the almost smile. She smiled back, fully, without qualification, and drank her coffee and watched the morning come in over the ranch that had become, without ceremony or announcement, her home.